detachment is what allows us to continue to engage in behavior that on some level we know is not right, or allows us to support behavior that on some level deep inside we know is wrong. You would think that when it was proven that it was not the same disease and that there was a 100% failure rate on development of treatments in animals, that they would stop funding it, but they didn't. And so we've sued the National Institutes of Health. That suit is ongoing because there's still $95 million being spent on sepsis studies on animals, something we know doesn't work. The response of NIH to this, to our request, was, well, now we need to know why it doesn't work.
Well, hello out there, peoples. How are you? This is Dotsie and Alexandra, and we are honored to be here with you again today. We're episode 250 something now, Alexandra. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but 5 years later, here we are. Oh, gosh. Oh, but it's this very special day. We have the magnificent Kathy Guillermo on, who's the Senior Vice President of PETA. And this is our fourth try to get this recorded. Mostly our fault, but Kathy's also a busy lady and she had a little bit of an injury. And so we're more excited than we normally are because we're so excited that we have her with us. She has a wildly impressive 30-year career. She's exposed cruelty to animals in laboratories, the horse racing industry, and major corporations, including cosmetics. Some of her many victories, because there are literally tens of thousands, include persuading Gillette and Estee Lauder to permanently ban animal testing. Also getting NASA to call off radiation experiments on monkeys and pressuring the Coast Guard to stop using goats and pigs for trauma training, which I have some questions about later because I never even knew that went on. Kathy also wrote the book Monkey Business, the disturbing case that launched the animal rights movement, which details the landmark Silver Springs monkey cruelty case that led to the first conviction of an animal experimenter on cruelty to animals charges. So we're honored and excited, like I mentioned, to have this animal rights luminary with us today to discuss the important work PETA continues to do and how each of us can take steps to affect change, and how animal rights, human rights, and the environment are all interconnected. Welcome to the show, Kathy.
Thank you, and you're awfully kind. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I kind of want to start with your words, but they won't be directly coming out of your mouth. But I just had to pause for a moment when I was researching you, because yours and my animal awakening story is just similar in the fact that we went from hamsters to dogs to horses. I mean, those are three very specific animals. So I don't know. I had to smile when I read that. And you started with a hamster named Hammy when you were little. And Hammy always came first. And it sounds like he had a rich array of food to eat, fruits and veggies. And he just lived where you guys lived, which I love, just in the family room. And that's where my hamsters lived until they started breeding. And my mom didn't realize that was going to happen. And then they went to the basement, which was finished, but because we had 50 hamsters just almost overnight. And that's a whole nother conversation. But next, you were 10 and you found an abandoned puppy. And I thought it was so sweet when you said, it had never occurred to me that a dog could be abandoned. And you went to the library and you found that there were organizations dedicated to helping homeless cats and dogs. And so you donated a few dollars and you jumped in. Then, still not putting two and two together, which was also me, you began riding horses. Your parents bought you a horse. His name was Buddy. My parents bought me a horse. Her name was Dreamer. And you showed him in English equitation, which is what's really trippy because that's exactly the style that I competed in as well. But you also did hunter jumping, which I didn't, but you took hunter jumping classes, I think. And then one day you saw a horse die on a racetrack. And that was your kind of moment where I think you say all the pieces fell into place and you stopped going to races and you stopped playing polo too. And you started working for PETA. And I'm not going to go all through my story. Listeners have heard some of it, but my horse was named Dreamer. And the day that we sold her so that I could upgrade to the next horse for English equitation and, win more blue ribbons, I'll never forget the day they shoved her in the trailer and took her away. And that day, that trauma, I realize now, set up an entire detachment system inside of me, that I had to. It is almost like it began an internal war inside myself, and I had to kind of divide myself into parts, if you will, kind of that felt no longer in alignment with the whole, so that I could be okay with Dreamer being sold and gone, and God knows where she went, right? So that I could do an upgrade. And so she drove away, and I went right to my trainer to find out my new horse's name. It was just like I had to detach from her very quickly in order to survive. And I imagine at PETA, you all have done probably some research and much discussion on how people are detached, right? Are we born detached from other species? How does it happen? Is it conditioning? Is it culture? Because I would say, I say the word detachment because I'm assuming that's probably mostly what it is. It was for me, and I think for you, how we didn't put it all together, right? That all beings matter. They all deserve to live free in their own experience. And so I feel certain you all have talked about this so many times. How do you invite people to care about animals? And what have you learned through all of your activism on why some people stay and remain detached?
It's a huge topic, and it's a great one, because detachment is what allows us to continue to engage in behavior that on some level we know is not right, or allows us to support behavior that on some level deep inside we know is wrong. And it's very tricky what brings about that moment. And I think if I may speak personally for a moment, I don't think I was detached in any way until I had horses and until I showed horses. Because suddenly, and this is what I see again and again in horse shows, horse racing, in polo, in any endeavor where animals are used in sport, the quest to win and to be good and to get out there ahead of everyone else becomes paramount. And the needs and the interests of the animals suddenly take a back seat. I see this in people who show dogs too. So just about anywhere that there is competition involving animals, we have to see some level of detachment. And I look back on it now, I'm slightly horrified. I don't think I ever did anything tremendously horrible to my horses, certainly not what I witnessed other people do, but I accepted what other people did. I accepted that other people used spurs and got horses to jump higher by whacking them on the shins as they went over that jump. I accepted that for many years. And then it was only later when I did make that connection. What brings people to that point varies so much from person to person. But in nearly every case where you speak to somebody who has made that connection and who has let go of the detachment or has become attached again to their real feelings, they have made some kind of a connection to some animal. I can't tell you how many thousands of people I've talked to who became vegetarian because they had a dog they loved, that kind of thing. That's what seems to do it. Also, so many of our undercover investigations are incredibly moving for people because you can see the suffering. If you don't ever have to look at it or think about it, it's really easy to be detached.
Very.
So those are the things that bring people back to themselves, as I like to think about it, because I think we're all born caring. I think it gets taken out of us, or we shove it aside in order to deal with things.
Just did pony club and did dressage. My mother's English, so we rode horses. That was what we did. And I remember asking my mom about the bit and stalls and saying, don't they get bored in the stalls? And doesn't the bit hurt their mouth when you pull it? It looks uncomfortable. Because when we played, horses and I was supposed to be the horse with the bit, it was always really uncomfortable to have something in my mouth like that. And I remember her saying, oh, no, they're fine. And I just went, oh, okay. I totally believed it. And my father, who had a couple pigs, I remember seeing the mother pig in what was really a gestation crate on his very small farm. I said, Daddy, why can't she move? And he said, well, otherwise she'd roll over on her piglets and kill them. And I believed it, but I never went into that barn, interestingly, because it felt so horrible. But there are these lies, and I've heard them even now as an adult from the dairy industry. Oh, I just heard this last week when I called a dairy farm, and they said, oh yes, they're actually not very good mothers, cows. They're not very good mothers. That's why we take them away right away.
They're still saying that?
They're calves. Oh yes. We take their calves away. So Kathy, it's really hard when we justify in so many ways our cruelty to animals.
It is. And, you can look back as an adult on your childhood and you can feel pretty bad. But I mean, frankly, what chance do children have? They have to get to a point where they can see those things for themselves. And of course, your instinct was spot on. You have these horses who really were designed to be out in the field with others of their own kind, munching on grass or, hedges or whatever all the time. And instead they're spending 23 hours a day by themselves in a stall. Of course it's wrong. And your instinct was there. I think it's getting back to those instincts that's so crucial.
Yeah. Speaking of horses, I'm just gonna dive right into something that's very controversial. After having ridden horses for so long and then traversing in my own athletic endeavors on a bike, thank God I switched from horses to bicycles. Most of the horses that are bred in the types of things that the types of ways that we rode horses, so English, equitation, hunter, jumper, and especially race horses, are very specifically bred to be high-end athletes. Could jump really high, they could race really fast. And I think Alexandra knows, I believe, and as I'm assuming you all do, that we should just never have done any of that to them ever, and had never even started. But since we did, when we rescue them, when they are rescued, many of them are not, but when they are rescued, I feel fairly strongly that we owe it back to them to allow them to live in a way that lets them be them, right? It lets them be who they are inside in their DNA, because that's what we bred them to be, athletes, and to run and to adventure and to run through creeks and go. And you can't just let them go. Like you can't just let the dogs go that we've rescued because they'd get hit by a car. And so I've seen a fair amount of horses, as we all have, on sanctuary property, who are in a field just standing there their entire lives now. I think that we owe it to them to exercise them like we exercise our dog, which would mean being on their back, bareback, figuring out a bit that isn't as uncomfortable as it could be, but just making them stand there in a field for the next 30 years, these extraordinary athletes. I don't think it's fair or right. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it depends very much on how it's done and where they live. So when you take a horse off a racetrack, for example, and it goes through the Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance, which is the racing industry supported retirement organization, they will do what they call repurpose those horses, which is not a term I love because, it makes it sound like you've taken your mountain bike and turned it into your beach cruiser. Right. There's something off-putting about that, but nevertheless, what they may do is take a racehorse and then help that horse, first of all, get through the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that the horse has, which they nearly always do coming off the track. And then that horse may go to a teenager who shows hunter jumper. It wouldn't be my first choice. Depending on how it's done, it's probably better than what the horse had. What I have seen in the places where we have placed rescued horses is a real effort to make sure that the horses, they're not ridden, they're allowed to be naturally horses, but that they have plenty to think about and plenty to do. So they have other companions. They're in enormous fields. A couple of the horses we rescued went to a ranch in New Mexico with hundreds of acres. So those horses are out there, and they are behaving in a way that really approximate what they would if they were one of their own ancestors many hundreds of years ago. So I have seen that, and it's fine. What we don't want to see, I think, is probably what you're referring to, a pen or a very small area with a horse in the middle of it, without companionship, without something challenging to think about, without something to do. Anytime we take in an animal, we've got to provide that animal with, mental stimulation, and emotional support and relationships. And horses really do like humans. I mean, you can have a good relationship with a horse. You can be out there running around, and the horse may even chase you once you've become, not chase you, but follow you once
I know what you mean.
built that relationship. So that there are ways to do it properly. I think in all cases, the horses their needs have to come first, ideally. It's not a perfect world, but that's what we strive for.
Yeah, I hear you.
What are some of because people love horses and connect with horses, can you tell us a couple of the campaigns or the issues that maybe our audience should be aware of when it comes to horses? Now, we just talked about getting racehorses off the track. There's things like soaring and other issues with wild horses. So can you just give us a couple so people are interested in helping horses? They might be able to find their path.
Yes, the areas that PETA has focused on are the areas where called, basically called sports, although I find it difficult to use that term when the horses are really not willing participants in this activity. But we have focused primarily on the use of horses in racing. We've done quite a bit of work on carriage horses, even though that's not a sport, but also the use of horses in competition that the international Equestrian Federation type competition of horses that we ultimately think of as going to the Olympics. We've primarily done work in those areas. And, it's not something a lot of people know about what happens to horses who are going to be used at that level of competition. But many of the same issues involved in racing are at work here. The use of medications, pain relievers, sedatives, anti-inflammatory drugs to keep injured horses going when they shouldn't be going at all, but should be recuperating. The use of procedures that are incredibly painful and dangerous, like cutting the nerves in the horse's feet so that they don't feel pain if they have chronic soreness, but it's also awfully dangerous. Many horses break legs that way. It's called a neurectomy. That's a problem in Olympic show jumping. Wow. The rigors of that world where horses are transported from one place to another, as with racing, as with any type of horse showing, these are all issues that impact the horse in kind of a terrible way. Not kind of a terrible way, and definitely a terrible way. And these animals have no say over their own lives, no agency, very little time to spend with others of their own kind. And across the board, this is what we see. You mentioned horse soaring, which is a really illegal and tremendously horrible practice used on Tennessee walking horses who are shown. And in order to get a very high step in the horse's feet, they will actually injure the feet of the animals, or inside their hoof area. They may put nails in there, or acid, something that burns the inside of their hooves, in order to get them to step up in a very high way, because it hurts when they put their feet on the ground. That's why they do that high step. Some people use very heavy boots. So, a boot may weigh 5 or 10 pounds on that horse. And then when they take that boot off, the leg naturally goes higher. And this is all because somebody thought it looks really good to show a horse in that way. So, these are some of the things that go directly to that sense of detachment, Dotsie, that you were talking about, because competition has suddenly become important. Winning has become important. And the horse, who is the very means of winning, has taken the back seat in the eyes of the people who are doing it.
And just because the horse has a really shiny coat and looks magnificent, people think, and maybe has a doting, someone who cleans their stall daily or brushes them daily, doesn't mean they have a great life. But we do think, they're so well cared for. But you're saying that there's so much stress and things that painful and that isn't natural in their lives, actually.
That's a very good way to put it. It is not natural. And if you look at thoroughbreds used for racing, incredibly beautiful horses. And we think we all know this because we've seen the Kentucky Derby on television. So we know, we've been told repeatedly, we know how beautiful they look, and we're told over and over again how well they are loved. They're like a member of my family. Yeah, right. I don't think so. Nearly every horse who lives on a racetrack, and most of them live on the track, they live in stabling on the racetrack, is on Pepto-Bismol almost every day because nearly all of them have ulcers. It's incredibly stressful. If you look at when they put the horses in the starting gate, you see how many of them don't want to go. Yeah. That's a real indication of how this isn't a fun thing to do for them at all. And I think the worst case I saw this was at the Churchill Downs in the week surrounding the Kentucky Derby this year, when 12 horses died in those weeks. And we called immediately for the suspension of racing at Churchill Downs, which ultimately they did, fortunately. But there was a horse called Lost in Limbo. I think that was the name, if I've got it correct. And this horse was being saddled, and they were getting ready to put him in the gate, and he resisted so strongly. He resisted with such ferocity that he dumped the jockey onto the ground, and he ran. He ran practically the full length of the backstretch of the track there. They captured him, they put the jockey back on, and they put him in the starting gate without apparently so much as a veterinary exam to see why he might have had this issue. And in the final stretch of the race, he did suffer a broken limb right on the track and was euthanized. And we had somebody there filming that day, so we got very graphic footage of that. And it's not nice to look at, but it is the reality. And the first thing they do when a horse breaks a leg on a track is bring out these big green screens, put it in front of the horse so that people don't see it, because they know very well that it is not acceptable to the public, that animals are suffering and dying for entertainment.
Exactly.
And we think that they're I was always told, another myth that I inhaled was they love to run because they're so itchy in that little stall thing before it opens up and they start running. So we all think, oh, this is what they want to do. But I've heard that they do things in that stall to get them revved up or something so that they'll go out of the gate really quickly. Is that true, Kathy?
Sometimes that's true. It definitely is. And I just have to say, yes, thoroughbreds love to run. It doesn't mean they love to race. It doesn't mean they love to be put through a starting gate and run as fast as they possibly can go for however long that race is. Those are two very different things. And, where we have seen horses revved up for racing in the most graphic and horrible way was our investigation last year of unsanctioned racing on what are called bush tracks. This is not racing that is approved by any of the 38 states where there are actually these bush tracks. They're quarter horses, and what they do to these horses to get them to run this short distance, to sprint this short distance, is very much out in the open. They're injecting them with drugs. They're hitting them with shock devices. They're whacking them with a crop before they ever start down the track. So in that case, it's very much out in the open. It's not always quite so out in the open in sanctioned thoroughbred racing.
That for people that are going, oh gosh, I didn't really know any of this. What is happening? There's a really wonderful book that I read just, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago called I Can't Watch Anymore. And it is an open letter to the International Olympic Committee written by Julie Taylor. And it's a case for dropping equestrian from the Olympic Games based on the fact that the Olympic Games say that they celebrate the athlete and the athlete's choice. And in this case of Olympic show jumping, obviously the horse is the athlete and they have no choice in the matter. Did you see anything change after that book came out, or was it just all lies were hidden, things were covered up, and just nothing changed?
That book is excellent, and it's not a long read, and anybody who loves horses should take a look because it really blows the lid off that high-level equestrian competition. What changed was after the 2020 Olympics, when there were several incidents involving horses in the games in Tokyo. And one of them got quite a bit of coverage. It was in the modern pentathlon, where the rider got on a horse she had no familiarity with. And that's part of the way the pentathlon works. You know, you are paired with a horse you've never met before, and you're supposed to take this horse over a series of jumps. Well, the horse was not having it, you know, and he was frightened and he panicked, and she kind of lost it. And she's whacking him and kicking him, and it was a disastrous round. But that's what I mean about the investigations. When people can see what these animals go through, this becomes a big deal. We immediately wrote to the International Olympic Committee, because I think that's who needs to hear from all of us. And the Modern Pentathlon Committee has eliminated horses as of the 2028 Olympics. So there will no longer be horses in the sanctioned modern pentathlon. That's crucial, I think. It's really important and shows what we can do when, first of all, we can get media coverage of this. We can get people upset because suddenly they know what's going on. I think the book that you're talking about, I Can't Watch Anymore, I think is the title of it. I think it will have a huge impact ultimately. Because it's so thoroughly researched and written in a very straightforward way, and makes the extremely important case to the International Olympic Committee that we were never meant to do the Olympics the same way we've always done them. Things change. The public attitude is changing. There are events that have been dropped from the Olympics in the past, and as we now know, horses in the pentathlon will be. The public is not at the same place it was 20 years ago or 50 years ago. If you look at the International Equestrian Federation, and I'm saying that in the English way, it's actually a French term, but I can speak English better than French. If you look at their Facebook page, they have maybe 1 million followers. Well, PETA's Facebook page has more than 5 million. This is a reflection, I think, of where the public is on the use of animals and things like this. We're just not willing to see animals suffer for human entertainment. So I think ultimately the impact of that book will be felt very strongly.
Yes.
Well, if circuses can give up animals, then the Olympics certainly can, right?
No, there's no question. I think the circus is a great example. There was a point where Ringling Brothers, after, you know, we did protest them for more than a decade, but there was a point where the public was with us, and there was a point where Ringling Brothers saw that. And the more people who get in touch with the International Olympic Committee about the use of horses in these games, the more they're going to pay attention. I think they're paying very close attention right now.
Maybe we can put that on our on the show notes, Dotsie, a link so that people can write to the
definitely. I wrote so I can give them. We can put the address in there. So the other thing that I feel like has changed over the years is people aren't willing to have animals suffer for beauty. And you were originally hired to work on PETA's cosmetics testing campaign almost 35 years ago. Is that right?
That is right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Back when we had a list of companies that don't test on animals, that was 12 companies long. That's all it was. And they were all mail order. So if you were committed to buying cruelty-free cosmetics, you had to send away for them.
Right.
And that's been a field that has changed tremendously in the last 3 decades. Yes.
Yeah. There's over 6,000 companies on PETA's list now, right? That are cruelty-free.
Yeah. Companies and brands. There definitely are. Cool. And I think the only reason that it hasn't ended entirely, because I think I can say with some certainty that in the US, it does not happen, really. It's a rare occurrence for a cosmetic ingredient to be tested on animals in the US if it's a cosmetics only ingredient. What has put kind of a wrench in the works is China, which has required testing on animals for cosmetics products sold there. Now we've made some progress since 2012 when we first exposed that. So it is under certain circumstances possible to sell cosmetics there without animal testing, but it takes a bit of doing,
Right.
to accomplish that. And the other place, believe it or not, is the European Union, which has the cosmetics directive law there, which theoretically makes it illegal to test any ingredients or finished products on animals. But unfortunately, they have loopholes. They allow a loophole for testing in China if that's not used as part of the safety data. And under the European Chemicals Agency, something we've been working on very hard over the last few years, under this chemicals agency, they will sometimes require tests on animals for these ingredients in complete contradiction to the will of the European Parliament.
I don't understand what they're still testing on. Like, to me, here we are in 2023. They figured out what you put in mascara that doesn't make your eye blow up or bleed or whatever is going to happen to it. What are they still testing on in China? What are they trying to figure out?
Yeah, it's in China, it's a matter of them not being up to the same level of sophistication on the science side of things. So when we first discovered this, which was the companies, a whistleblower inside a company was the one who informed us that this was going on. We had no idea before that. Nobody did. What we found is that they had no familiarity with the non-animal tests there. And so we gave a seed grant of $60,000 to a firm a nonprofit organization that specializes in training scientists in non-animal methods. And they sent a team of people to China to begin to educate the scientists there. They put together a consortium of cosmetics companies. The cosmetics companies have worked very hard to end this. To me, that's good, although I wish they would say we're not selling there until it does end. That would be my first request. So now it is possible, with the scientists there educated in these methods and laboratories in place to do the testing, if certain cosmetics are manufactured in China, they can be sold without animal testing, and under certain circumstances they can be imported and sold without animal testing. The problem is that if they are baby products, if they are so-called special use products, which would be hair color, disgustingly something called skin whitener, which is very popular in China. Products that do something that there's a claim to, a dandruff shampoo, those are still required to be tested on animals. And so that, I think, comes from fear on the part of the government about what will happen if consumers are injured, because this is a country where somebody who, an official who was not following the rules with food additives and somebody died as a result, that official was executed, as was his wife. So I think there's a great fear in China for their own safety as a result of what could happen. I'm not excusing it in any way, because the bottom line is these are cosmetics. This is not anything life-saving. Nobody should die for this. Nobody should die for any of it. But, at the very top of that list would be something that we put on our faces.
So I just want to bring up now, because I used MAC products in the 80s because I was the impression that it wasn't tested, and Joe Blasco too, when I was working on a film set. Then MAC is one of those companies that began testing, and I was horrified because I had been using it for years and didn't know that it was. So for people who want to really know whether their products are tested on animals, you can download the Bunny Free app for free, and it's really a great app. There's several others too, Cruelty Cutter, and there might be another. I have 3 on my phone, and I just check them. If one doesn't come up, then there's another. But the Bunny Free is by PETA and is very, very thorough. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what someone can do to make sure that their favorite product is cruelty free? Because what came up too a couple of days ago with a friend of mine is the term vegan, does that mean cruelty free, or does that just mean it doesn't contain animal bodies?
Yes, that's such a great question, because I think it's confusing. There are, at least in the US, there are no laws that regulate the labeling of products in this way. So there are a few ways. One is the Bunny Free app that you mentioned, which you can just Google, and it's a free app. You can download it. We also have a list online, which you can check. It's the PETA Beauty Without Bunnies list. It's PETA.org/cruelty-free is that. And that's one way to do it. And PETA is now the only group that will list companies without exceptions, because all the other certification programs make exceptions for animal testing under certain circumstances. So I do, I'm proud of that. We've always said whether we have one company or 10,000, we want to be sure that none of them are testing to the greatest extent that we can be certain of that. So they can go online. Companies have the option, once they're listed with us, of licensing a logo. And so if you see the PETA logo, it's not the PETA logo, but a logo put out by PETA with a little bunny with big ears on that bunny, that will indicate also that it's listed with PETA. Now, not every company uses that, but for example, right now, if you look at Suave products, it's on the front of their bottles. So they're, it's such an important issue for these retailers and these manufacturers to deal with. The issue of what makes cruelty-free, that is an evolving issue. For years, we talked about cruelty-free simply in terms of non-animal testing. Right. So if a product didn't test, if the company, and I should back up just a moment so I'm very clear, what we require is a company or a brand policy. So it's impossible to know what's happened with a particular product. So we don't say this product was tested on animals, but we can say this company has a policy of no animal testing under any circumstances. For years, if the company had that policy, we called them cruelty-free. But as this issue has evolved, it's not really cruelty-free if it's got lard in it, right? If it's got animal bits and pieces in it, we began to see that's not really cruelty-free. So our definition, PETA's definition of cruelty-free, is not tested on, the company has a no animal test policy, so the products are not tested on animals, and there are no animal ingredients. So our listings, for example, is either animal test free or animal test free and vegan.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
Can we talk about bunnies and other animals in labs? I think people, Dotsie, you brought up testing for cosmetics. Can we talk about testing as a whole and how these alternatives are? What are they and how many are there? Because a lot of us hear the excuse, well, we're not there yet. So we have to use animals.
Right. Yeah, we are there. When people say we're not there yet, where we can stop animals, we are there, because what we know now is that tests on animals are failures. I mean, we now have the science in our corner. A very important scientist named Dr. Pandora Pound has just written a book on this. It's called Rat Trap. And it is about basically the hijacking of the research world by animal experimenters who continually put out this myth. But Dr. Pound's research, first published in the British Medical Journal in 2004, showed that basically we as humans get nothing. There's no return on the investment in tests on animals, because 90% of them failed to lead to anything to help humans. And she continued that work and published a second piece in 2014, basically found the same issue. And that was the inspiration for PETA scientists to put together what we call the Research Modernization Deal, which is a plan for ending animal experimentation. First of all, we lay out the science. For example, when I say you, I think the public has heard over and over again. And if not, listen, because 95% of new drugs that appear effective and safe when they're tested on animals fail in human clinical trials.
Yeah.
We have a 95% failure rate on the development of drugs. And when you look at specific disease areas, which our research modernization deal does, you see it's even higher. You look at neurodegenerative diseases, for example, it's like 99% failure. And Alzheimer's, the utter failure of drugs for Alzheimer's, for stroke, for a whole host of issues. It is not working. So the idea that somehow science will come grinding to a halt is a false narrative put out by people who make their living experimenting on animals and by the National Institutes of Health, the US funding agency that pays for more animal experiments than any other agency in the entire world. So you've got an endeavor, animal testing, that fails 90% of the time, but it gets half of the research budget of the National Institutes of Health. It's utterly ridiculous.
How is that? What do the scientists argue when we have the rates of failure as high as 90%, 95, 99% in the Alzheimer's research? What is their argument? Or is there not one? It's just money that they just, that's how they can get the funding for the research they want to do.
Yeah, it's both.
Who's not listening to that 90, 95, and 99%?
Congress. And that's where we need to, they now are aware of what the research modernization deal is, and now they need to put it into action. But yes, their excuse is, well, it's the best we've got. Yes, there are issues, but it's the best we've got. And we finally have challenged that legally. In 2013, a systematic review of all sepsis studies on mice showed that it's not even the same disease in mice that it is in humans. It affects mice in an entirely different way than it does humans. And sepsis is something that is a leading killer in the US. More than 100,000 people are afflicted with sepsis in hospitals every year. This is serious stuff, but they were pouring all this money into it. You would think that when it was proven that it was not the same disease and that there was a 100% failure rate on development of treatments in animals, that they would stop funding it, but they didn't. And so we've sued the National Institutes of Health. That suit is ongoing because there's still $95 million being spent on sepsis studies on animals, something we know doesn't work. The response of NIH to our request was, well, now we need to know why it doesn't work. Which is sort of like saying, I don't quite understand the inner workings of my Tesla, therefore I'm going to tinker with my bicycle. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But I think the big problem is that NIH is controlled by animal experimenters. We know that many of these review committees that look at the proposals for funding are actually made up of animal experimenters. So that's what they know. That's what they're furthering. So we really need an enormous shift in the way that we approach research in this country.
Enormous.
When, the pharmaceutical companies also are using these non-animal tests to find the ingredients and make their own drugs. And then when they get to the FDA, they have to test on animals because the FDA says, but they don't necessarily want to. It takes so much longer. It's so hard to reproduce. They often will go from one animal to another because it won't work in an animal, even though it's worked on human tissue, for example, it won't work on one animal. So they'll move to another animal and then it works and they go, okay, here, so there's so much more room for fudging the numbers when you use, or not fudging the numbers per se, but there's so much bad science when you use animals because these companies are just caught by these regulations that force them to test on animals when really, ultimately, they use these non-animal tests already. Most of these big companies that make successful drugs because they know that 95% failure rate. And because the NIH isn't pushing forth this new science of trying to get more tests. Now, could you talk, Kathy, about the tests that are out there? Not necessarily the specific tests, but the paradigms, the modalities that people are using instead of other species.
Yes. Yes, and you're right about those companies, and that was the significance of the passage of the FDA Modernization Act earlier this year, which finally statutorily gave the FDA the authority not to require animal tests, or I should say, to more properly grammatically, gave them the authority to accept new medication that had not been tested on animals. And some of the things that these companies are using involve computers. It's fascinating, the programs that we have now, where so much data can be put into a computer that you can actually then put in, for example, a new formulation of ingredients for a particular medication, feed that through the computer, and get results on the likely effect on the different organs of the human body. The much talked about organs on a chip. This is incredible technology, these microfluidic devices made of cells that can actually mimic what goes on inside a human body. And there are chips for various organs. So you would have liver on a chip, or heart on a chip. When these things are all developed, they can be put together, so to speak, so that we get a sense of what will happen with a medication going through a whole human body. There are some really good cell-based cultures for determining the effect of medication or a formulation on humans, and now artificial intelligence we're seeing too, in similar to the way that the very high-powered computers can do. If you can put in this massive amount of information, it can give you a great deal of information back. And there can be testing with human volunteers as well, something called microdosing. Once you've gone through these non-animal test methods and you think you've got something that might be effective and might be safe, you can give minute amounts to humans and see if there's any sort of issue with those products. And all of those things have been determined to be safe and certainly more effective than the tests on animals. And you're quite right about the companies. There are actually scientific conferences where pharmaceutical companies discuss the fact that they've got a medication they think will be effective, but it doesn't work in animals and they can't get past the FDA. So we're hoping now that this can be done. It's going to take, I think, quite a bit of effort, and our scientists are working with some companies on that now.
I think I mentioned in the intro that you actually headed the laboratory investigation division at PETA. I want to hear about some of your victories that had to do with NASA and the U.S. military, and especially something I know that I talked about in the intro, the Coast Guard's usage of goats and pigs in medical trauma training drills. What were they doing, and how did you end that?
Yeah, that it's depressing to think about, but we have made so much progress there that I feel really good about things now. But we first heard about this, it's sometimes called live tissue training, believe it or not, to refer to an animal as live tissue. Still kind of blows my mind, but that's how it's referred to in the military. We call it, trauma training, because it was a method to train medical corpsmen, and to some degree, just in the beginning when we first found out about it, it was any soldier who was deployed, not just the medical corps. And what they did was anesthetize pigs or goats and then stab or shoot them. I mean, it's quite graphic. And then the idea was that these soldiers would come together and they would fix up the animal in some way. And that would approximate what might happen in a battlefield if a human is injured. Now, never mind that a human is quite a different animal from a pig or a goat, right. And a lot of this is muscle memory when you do these medical things. And if you've learned it in a different species, you still have to learn it in a human. One of our arguments that we used. But we found out about it because soldiers called us, which I found quite brave. That soldiers who probably aren't really allowed to do that, or their spouses in some cases, got in touch with us and said this is going on. And so we began protesting it, but then we began also talking to members of Congress, including physicians in Congress, people who had been in the military. Brian Mast is one who lost a limb in battle, and we worked with medical trauma physicians who could educate the members of Congress about the reality of learning on animals as opposed to learning on animals. And how it was so much better to use very sophisticated simulators that are human anatomy. And so the first part of the military that eliminated its use was the Coast Guard. And that was incredible. They have a policy against it. We now know that it isn't being done or hasn't been done in the last year in the other branches of the military, which is a huge step forward from a time when basically every deployed soldier went through this. Then it shrank down to only the medical corps, and now it has shrunk down to simulators, which are actually a good thing. Now, the special forces are still using animals, and some of the FBI, believe it or not, some of the security for the security divisions of the government are still participating in trauma training classes, but it's much smaller than it was several years ago when we started.
I mean, I'm thinking about the trauma to the human that when they have to stab or shoot the goat or pig, because somebody has to do that.
It was horrible.
Not trauma inducing itself.
It definitely is trauma inducing, and this is why so many of them got in touch with us, and some of them gave us video footage that they had taken of what happens, and that's of course makes a huge difference when you can see it. And the in one of the cases, the disrespect on the part of the hired firms that were teaching the course, the disrespect to the animals, the disrespect to the women who were among the soldiers or the medical personnel was really stunning. And so one of the things we uncovered is that the man who actually came up with trauma training on animals and then subsequently started his own company and then contracted with the military actually lost his medical license in 2 states because it was discovered that he was sexually exploiting soldiers in his training courses. And so it all sort of came together at that point, that somebody who could do this to animals certainly had no respect for the human animal either.
And what is when you say simulator? Because I know that when you want to fly jets, I guess you go into a simulator and that's how you learn. And I think astronauts do the same thing. Those are really important things to learn, just like stitching a human up. Are the simulators that good too?
Oh, they're incredible. If you ever look at the video of them, you will not believe it. The Trauma Man simulator is like a human being and has tissue and has vasculature and has the same airways so that you can practice putting the tube down the airway or a tracheotomy. They bleed. You can actually detach a limb and have to sew up the vasculature. They're really astonishing what they can do now. And so when you've used the simulator, you actually know, well, okay, this is what a human leg is like. And we have heard again and again from physicians who are in the military that the use of the animals is really just a kind of a hazing. It's a waste of time. It doesn't teach them what they need to know. And so what they have to do is use the simulators. And there are some branches of the military or some bases that have actually gone into hospital trauma units and have observed there too, and in some cases participated in the treatment of human beings who've been stabbed or shot, because that is literally what they would be doing on the battlefield there.
A lot of people think that animals are protected by laws. Can you talk a little bit about the Animal Welfare Act, whom it covers, and also how strong are the laws that protect pets versus farmed animals versus wildlife versus exotics, and how do we compare to the rest of the world? That's a big question, but I'm sure you have some thoughts. So you don't have to answer every single aspect of that.
Well, yes, it's such a good question, because I think that we have been told repeatedly, especially by people who experiment on animals, that they're heavily regulated, and that's my area of expertise. So I'll start there. First of all, we can just say they are not. The Animal Welfare Act is the only federal law that protects in any sort of way animals who were in laboratories. It doesn't deal with the kinds of experiments there are. It doesn't prohibit any experiment on animals. It also doesn't cover 95% of the animals used. And these would be mice and rats, birds, fish, reptiles. And strangely enough, any so-called farmed animal who is being used in agricultural research. So I have the thing I used to say to people who came to work at PETA, when is an animal not an animal under US federal definition? because we dealt at one point with a ship that was bringing pigs from Washington state to Hawaii. Some of them were going to be eaten. Some of them were going to be used in agricultural research, and they were being mistreated and neglected allegedly on the ship. So the ones who were going to be going to agricultural research, there was nothing that they could do about those pigs because they weren't covered. But the ones who were going to be used for food were covered. This is the same species. This is how illogical this federal law is in many ways. It's all we've got. And what it does is mandate certain housekeeping standards be met. And that's then the authority of the U.S. Department of Agriculture to go into laboratories to inspect them to see if they are abiding by these very minimal laws. It does establish the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which was something that came about in the mid 80s after PETA's expose of some primate laboratories. And it is supposed to be a committee that reviews all the proposals for animal experiments and makes sure that a search for non-animal methods has been done. That's a requirement under the Animal Welfare Act. Unfortunately, there's no requirement that they be used if they found any. The IACUCs have become, or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, called IACUCs, have become rubber stamp committees. So they are often populated primarily by people involved in animal experimentation or the veterinarians who work at the laboratories. So I can say very confidently there really is practically zero protection for animals in laboratories right now. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of paperwork, but when you come right down to it, even when a facility violates the law, the punishment is so minimal that it's essentially the cost of doing business. It's a little slap on the wrist. You know, we see places like the Washington National Primate Research Center and the other 6 primate centers repeatedly, seriously violating the law. Monkeys escaped and caught behind cages and not found till they died. Surgeries conducted on the wrong animals. Surgeries conducted and equipment left inside the animals, which then later caused the animal to die. Monkeys put through high temperature cage washes accidentally. Repeat serious violations, and they're still in business and still getting tens of millions of dollars from the government.
To do experiments that don't really serve humans in the end at all. What about pets versus farmed animals versus wildlife versus exotics? Is there any, I think we really feel like the government is protecting these animals.
Yeah.
But you've proven that certainly when it comes to labs, that's not the case.
It is not the case. And I think where we've seen huge progress is in the use of animals for entertainment in roadside zoos. The Tiger King stories, the work that our attorneys have done in closing down these roadside zoos and getting these tigers, the elephants, the chimpanzees, the other animals out of these facilities and into sanctuaries by using the Endangered Species Act and the laws that are available on the book. The Animal Welfare Act, again, is mostly a housekeeping issue, though. And for many of these facilities, if they're registered facilities and not licensed facilities, it's difficult for the USDA to put them out of business. Now they can cancel a license, they can close down a roadside zoo. They can't, and they could if they wanted, close down a puppy mill. They can't close down a laboratory. So the differences are stark. I think we have seen in other laws the protection of animal companions in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And certainly in the last 30 years, I have seen district attorneys and law enforcement take much more seriously the violations of animal cruelty laws, and they will go after them. We have seen not enough, but sometimes, and in a very meaningful way. Again, that's not part of the Animal Welfare Act. Those are state anti-cruelty laws. And I think that's kind of where the hope is. After the Envigo case, you may be aware of the beagle breeding facility that PETA did an undercover investigation about, led to changes in the law in Virginia, and ultimately led to the involvement of the Department of Justice in the closure of that facility. USDA did essentially nothing. A few slaps on the wrist, and their complicity in what can only be called a cover-up was really stark, as exposed in an article by Reuters. And I know it's a lot of information to give you, but I could just say in sum, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has been a great disappointment when it comes to enforcing what laws there are. And we have seen much better action from state agencies and from local law enforcement.
Well, congratulations on getting those 4,000 beagles adopted. And there was a lot of publicity about it, and people were horrified. Beagles, folks, are, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, 96% of the dogs in labs are beagles. Is that correct? That are tested, who are tested on because of their docile nature and their, well, mostly because they're docile nature and they're not very big.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that number is about right. And it is kind of stunning because, if you know a beagle, and you will never think of them as anything other than wonderful animals, and to think of them exploited in this way. And that is one amazing thing that came out of it, was the education of members of Congress about beagles and about experimentation. I think that case did so much to show them that it is possible that good science is not being done.
We're picking so many areas of your work for you. I'm interested in a victory or two victories that that you're most proud of over your years there.
Oh, that's a sweet question. A few things that come to mind. Our Cruelty Investigations Department, about 12 years ago or so, did an investigation of a test facility for dogs, cats, and rabbits. It was called PLRS. And what they found was just the most stunning abuse of dogs and cats and rabbits. And this was a contract laboratory that tested flea and tick products mainly.
Oh, God.
Companies that produce these products for consumers. And, people cursing at the dogs, kicking the dogs, picking them up and flinging them across the room. It just was an incredibly violent environment that had year after year been inspected by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and everything was supposedly fine. We heard otherwise, and so we went in there and we got the video showing it. And within about 2 weeks of the release of that video, that facility had closed down, and all of the 200 animals had been released for adoption. I think that's probably the warm moments that I think about. And that, there are a number of other cases like that where you just think, how can this go on? And then somebody hears you. There was another one that is important to me. It was a small university in Texas that had somebody on staff who was studying metabolism, which really meant that he was starving mice and lizards and frogs and other tiny animals who are so often neglected, and yet, are beings just like us. And it was a Catholic university. And we contacted the university and said, what kind of a thing is this going on in your Catholic university where this is allowed? And it took us some months, and we were never really very public about it because we felt that we were getting the university to listen. And then he was let go from that university. So cases like that where somebody says, this is just beyond the pale and it has to end right now, those are the most meaningful to me.
Yeah. Ugh. Just good on you. I love both of those. I know our audience will too.
Yeah, congrats. There's so much that PETA does that people don't realize. And I hope you're proud to be, like, the word PETA is like the term Kleenex for facial tissue. It means animal activist. And people use that as a disparaging, those PETA people. But I think PETA is amazing. And you're proving that with all the amazing campaigns that y'all have done that people don't really realize about. It's not, it's so serious, and you're saving so many lives. Can you give some thought, give some ideas to our listeners if they want to help? What can they do for animals?
You said something I think is really important because, we're also known for our sort of outlandish publicity events as well, which I'm also proud of, because we'll do what we need to do legally and peacefully to keep this issue before the public's eye. And there is a lot that they can do. I have an incredible staff, including quite a few scientists, people who worked at universities and at the National Institutes of Health, thought better of it, switched careers, That's important. And these people have a great expertise. We have somebody from Colombia, South America originally. She has a PhD in environmental sciences, and she got a whistleblower call from somebody in Colombia about a laboratory there. And I won't go into detail now because this is not really your question, but I'm getting to the answer here. Over a period of 18 months, she uncovered that this place was a fraud, even though it was funded by the National Institutes of Health, collaborating with NIH scientists and with scientists from around the world, and yet was conducting illegal experiments, had captured animals illegally, was conducting fraudulent clinical studies, allegedly now. And she put all this together carefully. We got investigations, we got the place shut down, we got the monkeys rescued, and finally we got NIH to stop funding it. And that has led to the introduction of a bill, the Cargo Act, it's called, that will make it illegal for NIH to fund overseas animal experiments. And the reason this relates to your question is that somebody inside a facility said something. Somebody who, when somebody is either working in, say, a university, say it's a janitor who's outside of a laboratory and has a sense of what's going on, those people are gold to us because they tell us what we would have no way of knowing otherwise. And so that's the first thing. If you know something, if you hear something, then come to us and we'll check it out. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that just by joining our activist group online, if you go to PETA.org, there's a place to sign up where you will receive action alerts from us, which are essentially emails and text messages. And very simply, by pressing a few buttons, you can have an email sent to a company. This is so important. When we were showing how horses were dying at the Kentucky Derby and around the weeks around that, 56,000 people sent emails. 56,000. That's just a tremendous number. Yeah. So to the greatest extent that we can swell those ranks, we can go to the companies that are making the cashmere or selling the cashmere or the Angora or the wool or the racetracks or the laboratories or the government facilities. And it really makes an enormous difference. So I would do that. And there are also, you can get on a list with PETA or with another group if that's what you prefer, but participate in protests. Everybody should be out there holding a sign at some point in their lives. It's just so important to be able to take advantage of what we can do in this country to protest animal abuse. So get involved in that way. You can do it through PETA or you could do it through other groups, but that's the main thing. Just get active, do everything that you possibly can.
I'm learning through our Ad Soy Act how important the letters are, because I just didn't think that Congress or the Senate or their staffers would care that much if there were some letters that came into their office. It turns out that they get plenty of letters, but not on the same exact subject of what people want. And we've sent just under 25,000, and just from Switch for Good alone, to each person's 2 senators and 1 representative, and it's making a difference. They do listen. The staffers, wow, we're really hearing about this. When we go to Washington, we have the conversations, we go to the different offices. And I don't know why I never thought that the letter thing really mattered. So I've started signing all sorts of letters, including PETA's and the letter to the International Olympic Committee. And it matters. So for anyone out who is listening that think that it doesn't move the needle, they really do. They really do.
Yeah, it does. It's everything. It's everything. And back when I started at PETA in 1989, there was no internet.
Right.
When people wanted to object, they had to sit down and write a letter. And before I went to work for PETA, I was a donor and would get the PETA newsletter, and I would get out my typewriter and I would sit there and type letters on all of the issues and send them off. Right. It's so easy now. This is one great
no excuses.
Millennials.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for being on our show, Kathy. And I think this has really educated me and so many of our listeners about all the different animal issues that there are to pay attention to and how much work there is to do. But there's a lot of people doing it, and a lot of people caring.
Yeah.
It's true. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.